Silas Vane didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Caleb Mercer's ranch house swung open hard enough to crack against the wall, and Silas walked in like he already owned the floor beneath his boots. Two men followed him, big, quiet, the kind of men paid not to think. Silas pulled a folded document from inside his coat and dropped it on the kitchen table where Eliza Hartwell was standing with a dish rag in one hand and the baby balanced on her hip. "Debt collection," Silas said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the room, measured it, priced it. "Your late husband borrowed money he never paid back. That debt now belongs to you." Eliza didn't move. The baby grabbed her collar and held on. "I don't owe you anything," she said. Silas smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. Courts disagree. If this story made your heart pound in the first 10 seconds, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the beginning, because none of this started with Silas Vane. It started with a woman who had nowhere left to go, and a man who had already given up on living. The advertisement had been tacked to a post outside the general store in Billings for 11 days before Eliza Hartwell finally stopped pretending she had other options. Cook wanted. Mercer Ranch, 40 miles northeast. Room and board provided. No nonsense tolerated. Inquire within or write to C. Mercer, Box 7, Billings Post. She'd read it the first time on a Tuesday morning while Thomas was fussing on her hip, and the last of her money, $4.60, was tucked into the hem of her skirt because she didn't trust the boarding house where she'd been sleeping. She'd read it again on Thursday. And on Saturday she'd made a decision, not because it felt right, but because nothing felt right anymore, and standing still was starting to feel like dying slowly. She wrote the letter that night at the small desk in the corner of the boarding house room. Thomas was asleep in the middle of the bed, surrounded by a wall of bundled clothing so he wouldn't roll off. She kept the letter short. She said she was a widow. She said she was a good cook, a widow. She said she was a good cook, which was true. She did not mention Thomas, which she would think about later with a complicated feeling she couldn't name. Not quite shame, not quite strategy, somewhere between the two. The reply came 6 days later. One sentence. "Come on the Thursday stage if you're coming, no salary mentioned, no questions asked." She told herself that was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and bought 2 stage tickets with money she didn't have left over. The ride took most of a day. Thomas was remarkable. He slept, ate, studied the faces of the other passengers with enormous dark eyes, and charmed an elderly woman named Mrs. Potts into surrendering half her lunch without even trying. Eliza held him and watched Montana open up outside the window, the land getting wider and emptier, the sky becoming a weight instead of a ceiling, and tried not to think about what would happen if this man Mercer took one look at her situation and put her back on the next stage going south. She thought about it anyway. When the stage stopped at the crossroads turnoff, the driver called Mercer Ranch, and Eliza climbed down into dust and afternoon heat with Thomas on her hip, and her single trunk being unloaded behind her. There was no one there to meet her, just a rutted road cutting northeast through grass, and far off, a cluster of buildings that might have been the ranch. She started walking. She'd gone maybe a quarter mile when she heard a horse behind her. She turned. A man on a dark bay gelding had come out from behind a stand of cottonwoods and stopped about 30 yards back, watching her. "You Hartwell?" he called. "I am," she said. A pause, long enough to be uncomfortable. "You've got a baby," he said. "I do." Another pause. The horse shifted. The man didn't. The advertisement didn't say anything about a baby. The letter didn't say anything against one, Eliza said. She watched him absorb that. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept well in a long time. Not sick exactly, but worn at the edges, like a good tool that had been left out in the weather too many seasons. He was younger than she'd expected from the terseness of the letter, maybe mid-30s. His jaw had several days of growth on it, and his coat had a tear along the left shoulder that no one had bothered to mend. "How old?" he said. 10 months. "Boy or girl?" "Boy." "His name is Thomas." Caleb Mercer looked at Thomas for a long moment. Thomas looked back at him with complete calm, and then reached for a button on Eliza's collar. Can he cook? Caleb said. Eliza blinked. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Maybe the ghost of one. I'm the cook, she said. He's just along for the scenery. Caleb turned his horse and started up the road without another word. After a moment, Eliza followed. He didn't offer to let her ride. She didn't ask. The ranch house was in better shape than she'd expected and worse shape than it should have been. The structure was solid, good timber, good bones. But the inside had the particular kind of neglect that comes not from poverty, but from a person who has stopped caring about the difference between living somewhere and just occupying it. There were dishes stacked but not washed, a window in the front room with a crack that had been stuffed with cloth instead of repaired, a coat on a peg near the door that she somehow knew, without being told, had not been moved in a very long time. There were 2 ranch hands, an older man named Pete, who had the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years looking into the sun, and a younger one called Dutch, who seemed afraid to make eye contact with anyone. They nodded at her when Caleb introduced her, didn't ask questions, and went back to whatever they'd been doing. Caleb showed her the kitchen, the small back room where she and Thomas would sleep, and the outhouse. That was the full tour. Meals at 6, noon, and 6, he said. Hands eat first, I eat after. Don't make anything complicated. What's been serving as meals up to now? She asked. Whatever Pete can manage? Which is? Salt pork and beans, mostly. She looked at the kitchen, at the cast iron pan with what appeared to be several weeks of history baked into it, at the sack of cornmeal in the corner with a hole chewed through the bottom, at the row of tins that, when she opened them, turned out to contain coffee, more coffee, something that had once been sugar, and a collection of dead beetles that had found the sugar at some earlier point. I'll need supplies, she said. Pete takes the wagon to town on Fridays. That's 4 days from now. Yes, it is. I'll make do, she said, because she didn't have another choice, and because she wanted him to understand she wasn't the complaining kind. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and walked out. That first night, she fed them cornbread and beans with salt pork that she'd rendered down slow and seasoned with the small amount of dried sage she found wedged behind a tin. It wasn't remarkable food, but Pete ate 2 helpings and didn't say a word, which she decided to count as a positive review. Dutch ate fast and disappeared. Caleb sat at the far end of the table, ate without commenting, and left a clean plate. She nursed Thomas and got him settled in the small room, then came back to wash up. She found Caleb still at the table, not eating, just sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The coat on the peg, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. In the front room. He looked up. Is there someone I should know not to disturb it for? The silence that followed was the wrong kind. She knew it immediately. My wife's, he said. She's been gone 3 years. I'm sorry, Eliza said. She meant it without embellishment. He nodded, picked up his cold coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. You can have the front room for the boys' things if you need the space, but don't move the coat. I won't, she said. He went to bed. She washed the dishes and listened to the night sounds of a ranch 40 miles from anywhere and thought, this is either the beginning of something or the end of everything. You won't know which for a while. 3 days later, she understood why Pete's cooking was what it was. It wasn't that he didn't try, it was that he genuinely didn't see the difference between food that was edible and food that was good. He'd been feeding working men fuel, not meals, and he'd been doing it so long the concept had stopped occurring to him as a failing. When she asked him what he'd been making before she came, he listed the rotation with complete sincerity. Beans and pork, pork and beans, cornmeal mush, beans with cornmeal on the side. And the hands never complained? She asked. Men working 12 hours don't complain about food, Pete said. They eat what's there. They'd work better if they ate better, she said. Pete considered this the way a man considers an idea that's never occurred to him before, and isn't sure whether to be offended or interested. Maybe, he said finally. Friday came and she gave Pete a list for the supply run that was twice as long as anything he'd been buying. He looked at it with something between concern and outright alarm. This is a lot of things, he said. Feeding people well takes more than salt and beans. Mercer's going to have questions. Then send him to me, she said. Caleb did not come to her. The supplies arrived Friday evening, and she said nothing about it, and neither did he, which she took as the closest thing to permission she was likely to get. That Saturday, she made a proper supper. Roasted chicken because she'd found 3 hens that had stopped laying and converted that loss into something useful, with potatoes and the last of the early carrots from a scraggly kitchen garden that had been fighting weeds on its own since nobody had tended it. She made biscuits from scratch. She made a gravy that Pete stood in the doorway watching with an expression she'd never seen on a grown man's face before, something close to disbelief. Dutch ate without speaking, the way Dutch did everything. But halfway through his plate, he stopped and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "That's real food." Pete nodded. Caleb ate the whole plate, got up and left. He was almost out the door when he stopped. "The garden," he said without turning around. "If you want to work on it, Dutch can help you clear it." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He walked out. She cleared the plates. Thomas, in his basket near the hearth, had fallen asleep with one fist around a wooden spoon she'd given him to keep him occupied. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like maybe this was tenable, maybe more than tenable. She didn't let herself hold on to the feeling too long. She'd learned what happened when you let yourself believe in things that hadn't proven themselves yet. The first real crack in Caleb's wall didn't come from food or proximity or any of the slow, ordinary ways that people usually begin to soften toward one another. It came from Thomas. The boy had been pulling himself upright for several weeks, holding onto furniture and Eliza's trouser leg, and anything else that would bear his weight long enough for him to stand and look at the world from 2 feet higher than usual. He was methodical about it, in the way that babies sometimes are, very serious, very determined, with the focused expression of someone working on a problem of great importance. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into Eliza's time at the ranch, she was in the kitchen and Thomas was in the main room on a blanket, and she heard the particular quality of silence that meant he was doing something she hadn't seen before. She came to the doorway. He was standing, not holding on to anything, standing in the middle of the floor on his own 2 feet with his arms out to the sides and his face arranged in an expression of enormous concentration. Then he sat down hard and looked surprised. Then he pulled himself back up. Eliza had her hand over her mouth. She was going to say something, but couldn't quite manage it because her throat had done the thing it sometimes did when she was unprepared for emotion. "He's been doing that for 10 minutes. She turned. Caleb was behind her in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. She hadn't heard him come in. "He didn't do it yesterday," she said. "No," Caleb said. "He only started this morning." Which meant he'd been watching before she'd noticed. She didn't say that. She turned back to Thomas, who had stood up again and was now looking very pleased with himself. Caleb cleared his throat. "His balance is better than you'd expect for his age." "He's been practicing," Eliza said. "He's been practicing since he learned to crawl." A pause. Then Caleb said, "He's stubborn." "Extremely," she said. Another pause. "That's probably useful," Caleb said and went back outside. But the next morning she found a small wooden rattle on the kitchen table. Rough made, clearly cut and sanded by hand. Something rattling inside. Dried beans, maybe. She turned it over. Thomas grabbed for it the moment she held it up and shook it twice and laughed. And the sound of it went through the house like something being knocked loose. The first major crisis came on a hot July night 6 weeks after Eliza arrived, and it arrived the way real crises always do, not with warning, but with Thomas burning up in her arms at 2 a.m. and the nearest doctor 40 miles away. She'd noticed he was warm before supper. Children ran warm sometimes. She'd nursed him, watched him, kept checking. By 9, he was fussing without stopping, which wasn't like him. By midnight, the fever was climbing in a way that made her stomach drop. And by 2, she was pacing the small room with him pressed against her shoulder and the thin wall between her and the rest of the house feeling like it might as well be a mile. She knocked. Caleb's door opened inside of 30 seconds. He was already awake. She would find out later that he was almost always awake at 2 a.m. "The baby's sick," she said. "He's got a fever and I can't get it to break. I don't know what I need. I don't have medicine. I don't have anything." He looked at Thomas. The boy was quiet against her shoulder, which was worse than if he'd been crying. Too quiet. "Bring him," Caleb said. He built up the fire. He sent her to the kitchen for water, which she'd already set to heat. And while she was there, she heard him go to a cabinet in the back room and heard the sound of things being moved around. When she came back, he had a tin on the table, homemade looking, old. "My mother's," he said. "Camphor salve. I don't know if it's still good." "Let me smell it," she said. She opened it, still sharp, still medicinal. "It's good." For the next several hours, they worked in the kitchen. Eliza walking Thomas, Caleb laying wet cloths in a basin and refreshing them, both of them checking the fever with the back of a hand, neither of them talking much except about the boy. The storm that had been threatening since dusk finally broke around 3. Rain loud on the roof, lightning walking across the hills in the distance. Thomas fussed, and then was quiet, and then fussed again. And each time he went quiet, the fear in Eliza's chest tightened another notch. Around 4, she sat down in the kitchen chair because her legs had given notice that they were done regardless of what the rest of her had to say about it. Thomas was in her arms, breathing, just breathing. She pressed her cheek to the top of his head. "His fever's coming down," Caleb said. He was crouching in front of her, not touching, just looking. "His color's better." "How can you tell?" Her voice came out strange, like someone else's. "My wife had a fever once," he said. "Before. I learned to watch for it." He stopped. "The color's different when it's breaking. It changes." She looked at him. He was looking at Thomas with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. Something stripped back and bare. Something that had been behind all the closed doors and worn silence. A grief so old it had become structural, built into him the way timber gets built into a house. "You lost a child," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd understood it piece by piece without being told directly. His jaw tightened. We didn't get far enough along. She died first." He stopped. "Both of them." "I'm sorry," Eliza said. "I've been sorry since you told me about the coat. I just didn't know how to say it." He didn't answer for a moment. The rain was steady outside. Thomas's breathing had evened out. "He's going to be fine," Caleb said. "I know," she said. She didn't know. But sometimes you say the thing you need to be true. Caleb sat back against the cabinet on the floor, in the space between the table and the wall, which was not a dignified place to sit, and not something he'd have done if he'd been thinking about it. But he was tired, and it was 4 in the morning, and something had shifted between them in the last few hours that neither of them had named yet. "What happened to your husband?" he asked. She had been waiting for that question for 6 weeks. "He was in a dispute," she said, "over water rights. He wouldn't sell. The man he was in dispute with isn't the kind of man who takes no for an answer, and the law in our county wasn't much help. Robert took ill that winter and died before spring. I've always thought the illness wasn't entirely natural." She paused. "I couldn't prove it. I still can't." "Who was he?" Caleb asked. "The man he was in dispute with." She looked at him. "His name is Silas Vane," she said. "He owns half of 3 counties and is working on a 4th. Something moved through Caleb's expression. Recognition, maybe. Or its cousin. "I know that name," he said quietly. "Most people in Montana do," she said. He said nothing else. Thomas slept in her arms with the fever broken, breathing slow and even, and outside the rain came down on a ranch that was, in some way, neither of them had quite registered yet, beginning to be something more than a place where 2 strangers happened to be waiting out their separate griefs. By August, the ranch had changed. Not in any way you could point to precisely and say, "There, that's where it happened." But the change was real. The kitchen smelled like food instead of absence. The garden Dutch had helped her clear was producing enough to supplement the supply runs. Pete had started setting the table before meals without being asked, which was the kind of small habitual courtesy that people fall into when they've started to feel at home somewhere. Dutch had begun, tentatively, to talk. Not a lot. He was not a man built for a lot of words. But he'd started asking Thomas questions, the kind people ask babies knowing the baby won't answer, real questions in a real voice, about what the baby thought of the weather or whether he liked the look of the mountains. And Thomas received these conversations with complete seriousness, which Dutch appeared to find deeply satisfying. Eliza caught Caleb watching this once. His expression was complicated in a way she was starting to learn how to read. Not just the surface layers, the guard, the distance, but what lived underneath them, the person he'd been before the losses stacked up. Dutch lost a younger brother, Pete told her one afternoon when they were working near the fence and Dutch was out on the range. Few years back, fever, same as what the baby had. He's never said much about it, but he kept that boy's jackknife in his pocket every day since. She thought about that for a long time. In September, she found Caleb fixing the window crack in the front room, not stuffing more cloth in it, actually repairing it, new glass properly set. She stood in the doorway and didn't say anything, and neither did he. But she noticed it, and he knew she noticed it, and something in that unspoken acknowledgement was its own kind of conversation. That same week, she found him at the edge of the property one evening, where a stand of cottonwoods overlooked the valley below, standing still, not doing anything in particular. She went out to him because it was supper time and the food was ready, but when she reached him, she saw his expression and didn't say anything about supper. He was looking at the view the way you look at something that used to mean something and is starting to mean something again, but the two meanings aren't entirely the same, and you're not sure yet whether that's acceptable. She loved this spot, he said, not turning around. He knew she was there. It's a beautiful spot, Eliza said. We used to come out here on evenings, just to watch the light change. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't come out here since she died. Eliza stood beside him and watched the light change the way it does over Montana, the colors going complicated and then simple and then complicated again. Thomas had gone to sleep early, and Pete was watching the house, which she hadn't arranged deliberately and suspected wasn't quite accidental. I don't want to take anything from her, Eliza said carefully. I know I'm here and she isn't, and I know what that looks like from the outside. I want you to know I understand that. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time in several days. His eyes were the kind of gray-green that changes color depending on the light. What does it look like from the inside? He asked. She thought about that honestly before she answered. Like two people who've both lost things trying to figure out what's left, she said, and whether what's left is enough to build on. He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at the view. The advertisement, he said. I put it up because Pete told me I needed to eat something that wasn't going to kill me before I was 40. That was his exact phrasing. He told me salt pork and beans, she said. That's the polite version. She almost laughed. It surprised her. She covered it with a sound that was less revealing. I didn't know what I was asking for when I put that advertisement up, he said. I thought I was asking for someone to cook food. I didn't think... I wasn't... He stopped, tried again. I didn't expect any of this. Neither did I, she said. They stood together in the cooling evening air and watched the last of the light drop behind the ridge, and the moment held the particular quality of something that is fragile not because it's weak, but because it is, for the first time, real. The Thursday Silas Vane arrived. She knew before she saw him. There had been a man in town the previous Friday asking about the Mercer Ranch when Pete was getting supplies. Pete hadn't thought much of it. Stranger asking after a local property wasn't unusual, but he mentioned it the way Pete mentioned most things, as fact without editorial comment, and something about it sat wrong in Eliza's stomach all week. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. More than one horse, which already meant something. Then the sound of boots on the porch, and the door, her door, their door, the door she'd spent 4 months cooking and washing and tending on the other side of, opening without a knock. She came out of the kitchen with Thomas on her hip and found 3 men in the front room. The one in front was maybe 50, lean, well-dressed in the way that men are when they want you to know that their money is old and their patience is short. He had a careful face, not unkind-looking exactly, which she knew from experience was the most dangerous kind. He held a folded document, and he was looking at the room with the eyes of a man doing arithmetic. He looked at her, and then at Thomas, and then back to the document. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Who are you?" she said, though she already knew. Silas Vane. He said it the way a man says his name when he expects it to produce an effect. I believe you knew my associate, the late Jerome Aldis. He was a business partner of your husband's. Robert had no business partners, she said. That's a matter of some disagreement. He placed the folded document on the table, her table, the table she'd set every morning for 4 months, and spread it open with 2 fingers like he was showing her something reasonable. Your husband borrowed $1,200 from Mr. Aldis in the fall of 1878. The debt was never repaid. Mr. Aldis passed 2 years ago, and the debt transferred to me as executor of his estate. The courts have reviewed the matter. What courts? She said. County court, Mrs. Hartwell, all properly documented. He gestured at the papers. You're welcome to have someone look them over. I think you'll find everything in order. The back door opened. Caleb came in from outside, still in his work coat, with the particular quality of stillness that she'd learned meant he was controlling something he didn't want visible. He looked at Silas Vane. He looked at the 2 men behind him. He looked at her. Who are these men? He said. Silas Vane, she said. He says Robert owed money. Caleb looked at the papers on the table without moving toward them. On whose property are those papers sitting? Silas turned. He gave Caleb a careful look, measuring the same way he'd measured the room. You're Mercer. I'm Mercer, Caleb said. You didn't knock. My apologies, Silas said, without any inflection that suggested he meant it. I understood Mrs. Hartwell was in residence here and thought, You thought you'd walk into someone's house, Caleb said, without knocking. The temperature in the room had changed. The 2 men behind Silas had gone very still, which was its own kind of language. Silas smiled, the careful smile. I have legal business with Mrs. Hartwell. It would be better for everyone if we could discuss it without— You can discuss it with her lawyer, Caleb said. A pause. I wasn't aware Mrs. Hartwell had a lawyer. She does now, Caleb said. You can leave those papers. Someone will be in touch. Silas looked at him for a moment with an expression that said clearly and without words, You don't understand what you're involved in yet, but you will. Then he nodded, once, and turned toward the door. His 2 men moved with him. At the threshold he stopped. Beautiful property, Mercer, he said, without turning around. Good water access, I hear. Then he walked out. The door closed. Eliza heard the horses leave. Thomas, who had been silent on her hip through the whole exchange, the uncanny social awareness that some babies have, let out a long breath and grabbed her collar. Caleb stood at the window and watched the road. You know what he wants, she said. The spring, Caleb said. The one on the east end of the property. I've had 3 inquiries about it in 2 years. All polite, all declined. He turned. None of them sent someone who looked like him. Eliza set Thomas down on his blanket. She picked up the papers and looked at them. They were well-made papers. Proper seals, proper language, a judge's signature that looked real from where she was standing. Robert never borrowed money from anyone named Aldis, she said. I handled our finances. I would have known. I believe you, Caleb said. He said it simply, without making a point of it, which was the most convincing way to say anything. She set the papers back down. He got Robert, she said. Not right away. It took 2 years. He wore him down, and then he made him sick, and when Robert was dead, there was nothing left to fight over. Her voice was level. She was keeping it level deliberately. I left because I thought leaving meant he'd have no reason to come after me. He has a reason now, Caleb said. The spring, she said. The spring, he agreed. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the papers on the table with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not fear, not anger exactly. Something focused and hard-edged that was either the beginning of courage or the last stage before defeat, and she couldn't yet tell which. He'll expect you to settle, she said. It's what people do. It's cheaper than fighting, and he knows it. I'm aware of what he expects, Caleb said. Are you going to? He looked at her. Thomas was on the floor batting at the edge of his blanket. The kitchen smelled like the soup that was going cold on the stove. The window Caleb had repaired was letting in the last of the afternoon light, and outside the cottonwoods along the ridge were starting to turn. No, he said. She held his gaze. It'll cost you, she said. Fighting men like Silas Vane always costs more than people think it will. I know, he said. You might lose, she said, because she'd learned that pretending otherwise was its own kind of cruelty. I know that too, he said. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the light shifted over the valley. And inside this house that had slowly, quietly, without anyone planning it, become something other than just a place where a broken man was waiting for his own end, Eliza Hartwell picked up her son and looked at Caleb Mercer and thought, here is where it either holds together or it doesn't. Here is the actual test. She had been tested before. She picked up the soup ladle. Then you'd better eat, she said, because we've got a long fight ahead of us and I'm not nursing anyone back to health on an empty stomach. He looked at her for a moment, and then something moved through his face. Not quite a smile, but the space where a smile had been before everything happened and might be again someday. And he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. Outside, the cottonwoods rustled in the wind. Thomas laughed at something only he could see. And in the east, 40 miles across the territory, Silas Vane was already planning his next move. The soup went cold before either of them finished it. Not because it wasn't good, it was Eliza had learned to cook under conditions that didn't allow for bad meals. But because neither of them could quite get their minds to stay at the table. Caleb ate mechanically, fork to mouth, eyes somewhere past the wall. Eliza watched Thomas more than her bowl, the way she always did when her thoughts were too loud, using his small, ordinary movements as something to anchor herself to. Pete came in around 7, stomped mud off his boots at the door, and stopped when he felt the quality of the room. Something happened, he said. It wasn't a question. Man named Silas Vane came by, Caleb said. Pete's expression shifted in a way that was very specific. Not surprise, recognition. The Vane that owns the Clarion Valley operation? Same one. Pete pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, which meant he understood this was serious. What did he want? He's claiming Eliza's husband owed money to a business associate of his. $1,200. Robert never borrowed money from anyone, Eliza said. She'd been saying it for 2 hours and would keep saying it until someone with legal authority agreed with her. Not from a man named Aldous, not from Silas Vane, not from anyone. I managed every dollar we had. I would have known. Pete rubbed his jaw. Vane's been buying up water rights across 3 counties. There's a man over in Copper Creek lost his property to him 2 springs ago. Said the same thing. Debt he'd never heard of. Papers that looked real. Judge that ruled against him inside of a month. The room was quiet for a moment. How'd he lose? Caleb asked. Couldn't prove the debt was false, Pete said. Just his word against a piece of paper with a seal on it. Vane had 3 men swear they witnessed the transaction. He paused. 2 of those men were on his payroll. Eliza set her fork down. She'd lost her appetite 2 minutes into the conversation and had been performing eating out of habit. He did the same thing to Robert. Not the fake debt. That's new, or maybe he's refined it. But the pressure, the patience. He doesn't come at you all at once. He comes in increments, each one reasonable seeming, until you're so worn down you can't remember what you started fighting for. Except you remember, Caleb said. I remember, she said. Caleb pushed back from the table. He went to the window that looked east toward where the spring fed down through the lower pasture in a thin, steady line that never ran dry even in August. He'd inherited that spring from his father, who'd chosen this particular piece of ground specifically because of it. It was the reason the ranch had survived 2 drought years when neighbors had watched their cattle die. It was the reason Silas Vane wanted it. I need to find a lawyer, he said. In Billings, Pete said. There's a man named Bellamy, Arthur Bellamy. He's old and he's expensive and half the county thinks he's too stubborn to take good advice, but he's the only one who's ever beaten a Vane claim in court. When did that happen? Eliza asked. 8 years ago. Small case. Boundary dispute. Vane tried to claim a strip of grazing land by saying the original survey was wrong. Bellamy found a copy of the original survey in the Territorial Records Office and walked into court with it. Judge threw the whole thing out. Pete shrugged. Vane pulled his claim, and that was the end of it. But he doesn't forget. Bellamy hasn't had a lot of clients from the eastern ranches since then. Because Vane makes sure of it, Eliza said. Because Vane makes sure of it, Pete agreed. Caleb turned from the window. I'll ride to Billings tomorrow. It's 40 miles, Pete said. I know how far Billings is, Pete. Pete nodded once and let it go. He pushed back his own chair. I'll check on the horses before bed, he said, which was Pete's way of removing himself from a conversation that had reached the point where presence became intrusion. After he left, the kitchen was quieter in the particular way of a house where only two adults remain, and neither of them is sure what to do with the space between them. Thomas had fallen asleep on his blanket near the hearth. Eliza picked him up without waking him. She'd gotten very good at that over 10 months, and stood holding him, not moving toward the back room yet. You don't have to do this, she said. Caleb looked at her. I'm serious, she said. This isn't your fight. It started as mine, and it can end as mine. I can take Thomas and find work somewhere else. I've done it before. Vane will come after the spring regardless, but at least you won't have to spend money on lawyers because of me. Is that what you want to do? Caleb asked. She was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet, not strategic quiet. No, she said. But wanting something and being willing to ask for it are different things. You're not asking, he said. I'm deciding. She looked at him for a long moment. Thomas breathed slowly against her shoulder. All right, she said. She went to put Thomas to bed. Caleb sat at the table for a long time after, looking at the papers Silas Vane had left, reading them slowly and carefully the way he did everything. Not with legal understanding, but with the specific attention of someone trying to find the seam in a thing, the place where it had been made and could therefore be unmade. He didn't find it that night, but he looked for a long time before he went to bed. But the ride to Billings took most of the day. Caleb left before first light and arrived mid-afternoon, left his horse at the livery on 2nd Street, and asked the man there where Bellamy's office was. The liveryman gave him a look that managed to communicate several things at once: surprise, skepticism, and something that might have been pity. What do you want with Bellamy? The man asked. Legal business, Caleb said. His office is on the corner of 5th and Mason, the man said. 2nd floor. But he's particular about who he takes on. I'll keep that in mind, Caleb said. The office was up a staircase that had seen better decades, with a door at the top that had Arthur Bellamy, attorney at law, painted on the frosted glass in letters that were professionally made but old enough to have faded along the left edge. Caleb knocked. A long pause. Then, it's open. The room inside was the kind of organized that looked disorganized to anyone who hadn't been the one doing the organizing. Papers in stacks that had their own internal logic, books flagged with strips of cloth at specific pages, a desk covered in documents with weights placed at strategic corners. A wood stove in the corner had been burning recently. The man behind the desk was maybe 65, with the kind of face that's been weathered by something other than the outdoors, courtrooms maybe, or the kind of sustained intellectual argument that leaves its own marks. He looked at Caleb over the top of spectacles that had been repaired at the hinge with a piece of wire. You look like a rancher, Bellamy said. I am a rancher, Caleb said. Then you have legal trouble, Bellamy said. Ranchers only come to lawyers when they have legal trouble. The successful ones come early, and the unsuccessful ones come when it's almost too late. Sit down. Caleb sat. He laid the papers from Silas Vane on the desk. Bellamy picked them up without touching the stack they'd been resting on and read through them with the speed of someone who'd read 1,000 similar documents and knew which parts mattered. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. Mercer, he said, reading the property reference. Yes. This is about the East Spring on the Mercer land, Bellamy said. You know it? I know the land, not the spring specifically, but I know Vane's interest in the Clearwater Basin water sources. He set the papers down. He's been moving on water rights for 4 years. This is the 3rd fake debt claim I've seen come out of his operation. He looked at Caleb. The other 2 didn't come to me. They settled, or ran. What happened to them? One man signed over the water access rights for a payment that wasn't worth half what the spring was worth, Bellamy said. The other abandoned his property entirely. Last I heard, he was working at a mining operation in Colorado. He paused. Vane bought both properties within 6 months at distressed prices. Caleb sat with that for a moment. The woman the debt is claimed against, her name is Eliza Hartwell. She's a widow who works for me. She says her husband never borrowed money from a man named Aldous. I believe her, Bellamy said flatly. I've seen Aldis's name on 2 other documents in Vane's orbit. He was a real person, a merchant in Helena, but he died without a will and without heirs, which makes his estate very convenient for someone who wants to construct historical debt claims. A dead man can't deny lending money he never lent. Can we prove it? Bellamy picked up the papers again. He looked at the date on the claim debt agreement. He looked at something else, squinted, sat forward. What was the weather in your part of Montana in the fall of 1878? Caleb thought. Terrible, he said. There was a storm system that lasted most of October. We lost access to the East Road for almost 3 weeks. Rockslide took out part of the pass. Bellamy said nothing. He was looking at the papers. What is it? Caleb asked. The document claims Aldous delivered a shipment of goods to the Hartwell property in October of 1878 as part of the loan arrangement, Bellamy said. If the road was impassable for 3 weeks, a shipment couldn't have been delivered, Caleb said. Not through the East Pass. Bellamy set the papers down again and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who has found the seam he was looking for. We'd need weather records, territorial survey reports, anyone who documented the blockage at the time. The Billings Courier ran a piece on it, Caleb said slowly, the memory surfacing. My wife, my late wife, she mentioned it. Something about relief supplies being delayed. The Courier archives go back to 1872, Bellamy said. If there's a piece, I can find it. He leaned back. Mr. Mercer, I won't mislead you. This will be expensive. My rate is $7 a day, and this will take weeks, possibly months before it gets to court. Vane will delay. He'll file motions. He'll make the process as costly as possible because that's how he wins most of his cases. Not on the merits, but on the exhaustion. What's your read on whether we can win? Caleb asked. Bellamy was quiet for a moment. I think the debt is fabricated, and I think I can prove it, but courts are unpredictable, and Vane has a lot of friends in a lot of courtrooms. He paused. There's also the matter of what he'll do outside the courtroom. He plays on multiple levels at once. I've been warned, Caleb said. Being warned and being prepared are different things, Bellamy said, not unkindly. Are you sure about this? Hire on, Caleb said. I'll get you the money. Bellamy looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen. Tell me everything you know about the Hartwell history with Silas Vane, he said. From the beginning, Caleb told him. He rode back the next morning. The 40 miles felt longer going home than going out, which was the opposite of how it usually worked, and he spent most of the ride running through the numbers in his head. Bellamy's retainer alone would take most of what he had in immediate cash. The rest would have to come from somewhere. A loan, if he could get one, or the sale of the 4 horses he'd been holding back from the last drive. He paid good money for those horses. They were worth twice what he'd paid. But they were worth nothing if Vane managed to take the spring. And without the spring, the ranch would lose half its productive value inside 2 years. He'd sold things before. After his wife died, he'd sold a lot of things. Not out of need, but out of the incapacity to look at them. He'd sold her horse. He'd sold a pair of silver-backed brushes from the dressing table. He'd sold a clock her father had given them. He told himself at the time he was being practical. He understood now he'd been trying to remove everything that reminded him of the life he wasn't going to have, and the only thing it had actually accomplished was making the house emptier. He was not going to let Silas Vane empty the house again. He got back to the ranch in the late afternoon. Eliza was in the garden, which she'd expanded since Dutch had cleared it. A proper kitchen garden now, producing more than it cost to tend. She had Thomas propped in a wooden box Pete had converted into a kind of portable seat and positioned near the bean rows so the boy could watch her work. Thomas appeared to find this deeply satisfying, observing the proceedings with the systematic attention of someone taking notes. Caleb unsaddled his horse, turned it out, and walked to the garden. Bellamy will take the case, he said. Eliza looked up from where she was tying back a sprawling tomato plant that had exceeded its stake. What's he like? Stubborn, Caleb said. Smart. He's seen Vane's methods before. Does he think we can win? He thinks the debt is false, and he thinks he can prove it. He wasn't willing to say more than that. That's honest, at least, Eliza said. He found something in the documents, Caleb said. The date of a claimed delivery doesn't match the weather conditions. If we can find records of the road closure in October of '78. The rock slide, Eliza said immediately. He looked at her. I know about it, she said. Robert mentioned it in a letter. He was traveling that fall before we were married. He got caught on the wrong side of the pass for 2 weeks and wrote me a letter about it because there was nothing else to do. She straightened up. I have that letter. Caleb was still for a moment. You have it with you? I kept everything Robert ever wrote me, she said. It's in the trunk. She looked at him with an expression he was still learning to read, the one where she was working something through and hadn't decided how much of the process to let him see. I didn't know it would matter. I kept it because it was his. It matters, Caleb said. Can you give it to Bellamy? I can give him the letter, she said. I'll copy it out first so I still have the words. She paused. The original is his handwriting. Does that make it more useful? Yes, Caleb said. She nodded. Thomas made a sound from his box. Not distress, just notification that he'd been sitting there long enough and had thoughts about the direction of events. Eliza picked him up with the automatic ease of a woman who'd been doing it for 10 months, settled him against her hip, and looked at Caleb. How much is this going to cost? She asked. More than I have in immediate cash, he said. I'm going to sell the 4 mares I've been holding. Caleb? It's done, he said. I've already decided. She looked at him for a moment. The sun was getting low and coming through the cottonwoods at an angle that put the whole garden in a kind of slanted light, and she had dirt on her hands and the baby on her hip, and that particular expression she got when she wanted to argue, but had already seen that arguing wouldn't change anything. I'll pay you back, she said. You don't owe me anything, he said. I'll pay you back, she said again. Firm, not negotiable. He could see that it mattered to her, not the money, but the having of it as a debt, the thing that meant this was a transaction between equals and not charity extended downward. He understood that. He'd been on the receiving end of charity that looked like help and felt like diminishment. All right, he said. 3 days later, Silas Vane sent a second message. It didn't come through legal channels this time. It came through a man Caleb didn't recognize who appeared at the ranch gate on a Wednesday afternoon and asked for Mrs. Hartwell. Caleb met him at the gate before Eliza could reach it. She's occupied, Caleb said. Who are you? The man was maybe 40, with the particular kind of face that gives nothing away because nothing is there to give. I have a message for Mrs. Hartwell from Mr. Vane. I'll deliver it, Caleb said. A pause. The man looked at him with the expression of someone assessing whether a problem is worth having. He apparently decided it wasn't. Mr. Vane wanted to convey that he's a reasonable man. He's willing to settle the debt for $800 or an equivalent arrangement in water access rights. He considers this a generous offer, given the legal costs the alternative would involve. I'll tell her, Caleb said. He'd like a response by end of week, the man said. He'll get one, Caleb said. The man nodded and left. Caleb watched him go until the dust settled. Then he went inside. Eliza was in the kitchen, and she knew from his expression before he said anything. What did he want? $800, Caleb said. Or water rights. That's less than he claimed Robert owed, she said. Yes, Caleb said, which means he knows the case isn't as solid as he presented it. She thought about that. Or he wants to close it quickly before Bellamy gets too far into the records. Both things can be true, Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen had the afternoon smell of bread that had gone into the oven an hour ago. Thomas was napping in the back room. Outside, Dutch was working the fence line along the east pasture, which Caleb could see from the kitchen window, the small regular figure moving along the wire with the unhurried purpose of a man who'd found a thing he was good at. Tell him no, Eliza said. Caleb looked at her. Tell him no, she said again. Her voice was steady. We're not settling. We're not giving him water rights. We're going to court, and we're going to let Bellamy do what Bellamy does. She paused. He wore Robert down because Robert was alone. Robert didn't have... She stopped, recalibrated. Robert didn't have anyone who understood what was being done to him. I do, and I'm not going to make the same mistake. Caleb held her gaze for a moment. All right, he said. He sent the message back the next morning. No settlement, no negotiation. They would see Vane in court. But the response came 8 days later, and it was not a legal document. It was Pete. He came back from the supply run on Friday afternoon with a bruised jaw and a cut above his left eye that had been cleaned but not properly treated, dried blood along the temple. He climbed down from the wagon without saying anything and started unhitching the horse with the particular focus of a man who is controlling a significant amount of feeling by performing a task very carefully. Caleb came out of the barn and stopped. Pete! I'm fine, Pete said without turning around. What happened? Pete finished unhitching before he turned. 3 men, on the road about 8 miles out, just past the Wickham Creek crossing. They came out from the trees. Did they say anything? One of them did, Pete said. Said Mr. Mercer should think carefully about the kind of legal trouble he was getting into, and whether the expense was worth it, and whether the Mercer property was well enough staffed to protect itself if something were to happen. He paused. Those were close to his exact words. Caleb stood very still. Are you hurt anywhere else? No, Pete said. There were 3 of them, and I'm one old man, but I gave one of them something to think about before they left. Broke his nose, I think. He touched the cut above his eye without much expression. Eliza's going to fuss. She is, Caleb agreed. Inside, she did. She cleaned the cut with the same thorough efficiency she applied to everything, which Pete submitted to with the expression of a man who finds care slightly embarrassing and deeply appreciated. Dutch stood in the doorway through the whole process, watching, not saying anything, which meant he was working through how he felt about it. When Pete had been fed and settled, Caleb went out to the main room. Dutch was already there, sitting at the table. I want to know if this is something I should be planning for, Dutch said. Caleb looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, is this going to get worse before it's over? Dutch said. Because if it is, I'd like to know. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not saying that. I just want to know what I'm staying for. It was more words than Dutch had said in sequence since Caleb had hired him. Caleb sat down across from him. Yes, he said. It'll likely get worse. Dutch nodded slowly. They'll try other things, Caleb said. Intimidation first, because it's cheap and it sometimes works. If that doesn't work, they'll try to damage the property. Maybe the herd, maybe the structures. He paused. I'm not going to tell you you have to stay for that. I'm staying, Dutch said, the same way he'd said it before. I just wanted to understand what I'm staying for. He got up, nodded once, and went to bed. Caleb sat at the table alone. He thought about the spring on the east end of the property, the way it came up cold and clear even in the worst of August, the way his father had walked him to it when he was 7 and said, "This is why we're here, son. Not the grass, not the timber. This." He thought about the 4 mares he'd sold to pay Bellamy's retainer. He thought about the lock on the barn that he was going to reinforce tomorrow morning because a lock only stops the honest and he was dealing with the other kind. He thought about Eliza in the back room, probably awake because she heard Pete come in and had understood what it meant, lying in the dark with Thomas sleeping beside her and doing the same calculations he was doing, in her own way, because she was that kind of woman. He got up and went to the window and looked out at the dark ranch, the shapes of the buildings, the stars that made Montana nights feel like both enormity and intimacy at once. The spring was out there somewhere, quiet in the dark, doing what springs do regardless of who was fighting over them. He thought, we're going to lose some things before this is over. I don't know yet which things. And then, because he was a practical man and worrying about it at midnight wouldn't change the morning, he went to bed. He was up before dawn. He reinforced the barn lock. He checked the fences on the east pasture. He moved the 3 remaining breeding horses to the closer paddock where they'd be visible from the house. He did all of this without waking anyone, in the particular quiet of early morning that he'd always found more useful than any other hour, when the mind was clear and the light was honest, and there was no one around to witness the worry he'd trained himself not to perform. At 6, Eliza appeared in the kitchen doorway with Thomas on her hip and looked at him with the calm assessment of someone who had also been awake for part of the night. How bad is it going to get? She asked. I don't know, he said. But I'm not going to find out by sitting still. She nodded. She handed him a cup of coffee. It was the good coffee, the kind she made when she thought something was difficult and didn't want to say so. I got another letter yesterday, she said. I should have told you last night, but Pete came back and it didn't seem like the moment. He looked at her. She went to the shelf above the small desk she'd set up in the corner of the kitchen, a thing she'd done sometime in the second month quietly, without asking, because she needed a place to write and manage the household accounts that Caleb had handed off to her without ceremony in week 6. From the shelf, she took an envelope that had been opened. It's from a woman named Clara Birch, Eliza said, handing it over. She and her husband owned property near my farm. She wrote to my old address in Helena, and the postmaster forwarded it here. Caleb read it. It was 3 pages, small handwriting, the kind of letter that had been composed and reconsidered several times before being sent. Clara Birch wrote that her husband had been approached by Silas Vane in the summer of '77 about water rights, that he had refused, that the following spring he'd been served with a debt claim he'd never heard of, for money allegedly borrowed from a man named Harlow Aldous, that he'd tried to fight it, that the legal costs had broken them inside of a year and they'd left the territory entirely. But that was not the part Caleb read twice. The part he read twice was this. My husband kept a journal. He wrote down everything, every conversation with Vane's men, every offer, every threat. He wrote down the names of the men who witnessed the delivery that never happened. Those journals are in a trunk at my sister's house in Bozeman. I don't know if they would help you, but I read about the debt claim against Mrs. Hartwell in a letter from our old neighbor, and I thought you should know they exist. Caleb set the letter down. Does Bellamy know about this? He asked. Not yet, Eliza said. I only got it yesterday. He looked at her. She was watching him with the particular expression she'd worn since he'd met her. Composed on the surface, a great deal happening underneath, a woman who had learned to think 10 steps ahead, because the first 9 had already not gone the way she'd planned. We need to get that journal, he said. I know, she said. Bozeman is 3 days' ride, she said. I know. He picked up the coffee she'd given him, which had gotten cold while he'd been reading. He drank it cold because there wasn't time to heat it up, and because he'd lived alone long enough that temperature had stopped being the point. Outside, the morning was doing what Montana mornings do in October, coming in hard and clear and cold, the kind of cold that promises worse to come. The cottonwoods along the ridge had gone fully gold and were starting to let go of leaves in the morning wind. There was a lot of ground to cover and not enough time to cover it in, which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly what Silas Vane was counting on. He set down the cup. I'll leave for Bozeman on Monday, he said. He left for Bozeman on Monday before the sun was fully up, with Robert Hartwell's letter in his coat pocket, and Clara Birch's address written on a folded piece of paper that Eliza had pressed into his hand the night before. She'd stood at the kitchen door when he went out, Thomas on her hip as always, and she'd said, "Be careful on the Wickham Creek crossing." He'd nodded. "I mean it," she'd said. "They know that road." "I know," he'd said. "I'll go around through the north cut." She'd looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then she'd handed him a wrapped bundle, food for the road, more than he'd have thought to pack himself, and gone back inside without making anything of the gesture. He thought about that for the first 20 miles, the specific economy of it, the way she expressed care as practical action and expected the same in return, which was either the most pragmatic or the most intimate form of trust he'd encountered in his adult life, and he hadn't yet decided which. The North Cut added 4 hours to the first day's ride. He camped that night near a creek that didn't have a name on any map he'd seen, ate the food Eliza had packed, cornbread and salt beef and 2 boiled eggs, better road food than anything he'd have put together, and lay awake for a while listening to the creek and thinking about the journal. If it existed. If it said what Clara Birch believed it said. If the sister would hand it over to a stranger who rode up on a Monday with nothing but a letter and a request. There were a lot of ifs. He slept poorly and was moving again before first light. Bozeman in October was a working town in the specific way of places that don't have the luxury of being anything else. The streets were muddy from a recent rain, and the air had the smell of wood smoke and horses, and the kind of cold that would be serious by December. Caleb found a room at the Douglas house, which was clean and cost less than he'd budgeted, and asked the proprietress where Elm Street was. 3 blocks east, then left, the woman said, looking at him with the frank assessment of someone who rents rooms to strangers for a living. Who are you looking for? A family named Dutton, he said. Clara Birch's sister. The woman's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled. Margaret Dutton, she said. She's the one with the blue porch trim. You're not the first person to come asking for Clara's things. Caleb stopped in the act of picking up his saddlebag. When was the other one? About 2 weeks ago, the woman said. Man I didn't recognize. Asked Margaret directly for a trunk that belonged to her sister. She said she didn't have any such thing and sent him away. She paused. She did have it. She just didn't like the look of him. I see, Caleb said. He found Margaret Dutton on her porch in the late afternoon, a woman in her 60s with the particular upright quality of someone who has withstood a significant amount and decided to treat resilience as a personal standard. She looked at him the way her landlady had, direct, unimpressed by the fact of him, waiting to be convinced. He introduced himself. He explained the debt claim against Eliza. He explained Bellamy and the court case. He did not oversell any of it because he had a feeling that overselling would cost him more than it gained. When he was done, Margaret Dutton was quiet for a moment. How is Eliza? She asked. She's well, he said. She has a boy, Thomas. 10 months. I know about Thomas, Margaret said. Clara wrote to me when he was born. She wrote to me about a lot of things. She paused. Did Eliza send you? She wrote your sister's letter, he said. She gave it to me. She said the journals were the best chance we have. Another pause. The porch boards were painted the blue the landlady had mentioned, faded now, peeling at the edges, the kind of maintenance project that gets deferred when other things take priority. A yellow cat materialized from behind a pot and sat on the railing and observed Caleb with the specific indifference of a cat. The man who came 2 weeks ago, Margaret said. He was polite, neat. He had a good coat. He said the journals were part of an estate matter and that Clara's husband's family had a legal interest in them. She looked at Caleb. Martin Birch had no family. He was an only son and both his parents died before he did. Clara told me that herself. Vane sent him, Caleb said. That's what I thought, Margaret said. She stood up. Come inside. Dad. The journals were 4 of them, sewn composition books of the kind sold at any general store, filled with Martin Birch's handwriting from cover to cover. Caleb sat at Margaret's kitchen table and read through them for 3 hours while she made supper and didn't ask him questions, which he understood as a form of courtesy. Martin Birch had been a methodical man. He'd recorded dates, names, exact conversations as he remembered them, amounts, and, crucially, the names of 2 men who had apparently witnessed the delivery claimed in Vane's debt document. Caleb wrote those names down. He wrote down 3 other names that appeared repeatedly as Vane's intermediaries. He wrote down a date in October of '77 when Martin Birch had received a visit from one of them, which placed it well before the window Vane was now claiming. But the thing that made his hand stop moving was a passage near the end of the 3rd journal, written in a tighter hand than usual, like Martin had been writing fast or writing angry. Spoke today with a man named Holcomb who worked for Vane 3 years before leaving his employ. He told me, and I'm writing this down exactly as he said it, that Vane has a system for these things. First the offer, then the fake debt, then the court. He said Vane keeps a man named Garrett on retainer who specializes in finding dead estates to attach debts to. Harlow Aldis is one of 3 names Garrett has used. Holcomb said there are records in Vane's office in Helena, original documents that predate the fake ones, showing the real state of the properties before the claims were manufactured. Caleb read that paragraph 3 times. Then he set the journal down and looked at the kitchen wall for a moment and thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean, and whether a dead man's journal entry about something a former employee had said qualified as evidence of anything in a court of law. He didn't know. That was Bellamy's question to answer. Can I take these to my lawyer? He asked. Margaret had been at the stove. She turned. Will they come back? I don't know how long the case will take, he said honestly. I can give you a receipt. I can have Bellamy. Take them, she said. Clara would want them used. She wrote to Eliza because she thought maybe something could still be done. And I'm not going to be the one who stopped it because I was worried about a receipt. She turned back to the stove. Stay for supper. The road's no good in the dark. He stayed for supper. Margaret Dutton turned out to have opinions about everything. The territorial legislature, the price of beef, the general unreliability of men who wore good coats to places where good coats weren't necessary. She was sharp and occasionally funny in a way that didn't signal itself, and Caleb found himself listening more than he'd intended to. You're in love with her, Margaret said, at some point during the meal. Caleb looked up. Eliza, Margaret said, I'm not asking, I'm observing. She cut a piece of bread. Clara wrote me about her husband, about what Vane did to them, about how Robert died worrying about what would happen to Eliza and the baby. She set down the bread knife. If you're going to fight for her, fight all the way. Don't do it halfway and then back off because it gets complicated. I'm fighting the case, Caleb said. I'm not talking about the case, Margaret said. He didn't answer that. She didn't press it. They finished supper and he slept that night in the Douglas house, and in the morning tied the 4 journals into his saddlebag with the particular care you give to things that matter, and rode back toward home. Nuts. He made it back in 2.5 days because he pushed the horse harder than he should have, and felt bad about it the whole time. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon to find Dutch sitting on the porch steps with a rifle across his knees, which was not where Dutch usually sat or what Dutch usually did. He pulled up at the gate. What happened? Caleb said. Night before last, Dutch said. Someone came onto the east pasture, cut the fence along the creekside, and spooked the breeding stock. We didn't lose any. Pete went after them at 3 a.m. before I even woke up, but 3 of them got into the north field, and it took all yesterday to bring them back. Anyone see who it was? No, Dutch said, but they left boot tracks and one of them dropped a bandana. Pete kept it. Caleb dismounted. Where's Pete? Mending the fence. Been at it since yesterday morning. And Eliza? Inside, Dutch said. She's fine. She didn't tell me to sit out here with a rifle if that's what you're thinking. I made that decision myself. Caleb looked at him. Dutch had the expression of a man who had worked through something internally and arrived at a place of clarity. I'm not taking issue with it, Caleb said. I'm grateful. He went inside. Eliza was at the kitchen table with Thomas on the floor beside her, and a piece of paper in front of her that, when he got close enough, turned out to be a list of names. She looked up when he came in, and the thing that moved through her face when she saw him was something she didn't quite manage to keep contained before she put it back. The journals, she said. I have them, he said. All 4. Her shoulders dropped about a 1/4 inch, which was all she would allow herself. Margaret gave them to you? Without conditions, he said. She said Clara would have wanted them used. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the list in front of her. I've been doing my own work while you were gone, she said. I wrote to 3 women I knew from the years near Robert's land. 2 of them wrote back. Both of their husbands had been approached by Vane. One received a debt claim and settled. The other had a fire. She paused. In the barn. No one was hurt, but they left after that. Caleb sat down. What are you building? A pattern, she said. Bellamy said the debt being false might not be enough on its own. Courts want patterns. They want to see that something wasn't an error. It was a method. She turned the list so he could see it. 6 names. If I can get sworn statements from any of these people, women, men, whoever will talk, about what Vane did to them or their families, Bellamy can use that. He looked at the list. He looked at her. You know what Vane will do if he finds out you're doing this, he said. He'll escalate, she said. I know. Eliza, I know, she said again, steadier. I've thought about it. I've thought about Thomas and what it means and what the risks are. But if we go into that courtroom with only the journals and the weather records, we're giving Bellamy a good argument and hoping the judge is honest. She looked at him directly. If we go in with a pattern, with names and dates and stories from people who were there, we're giving Bellamy the truth, the actual truth. And that's harder to buy off than a good argument. He was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected him to say it that fast. Something in her expression recalibrated. I know I'm right, she said. I just wanted you to say it. He almost smiled. It happened faster than he expected, and he let it. He rode to Billings the following week with the journals and spent 2 days with Bellamy, who read every page of Martin Birch's notebooks with the focused attention of a man who has been practicing law long enough to know the difference between useful and crucial. The passage about Holcomb, the former Vane employee, was what stopped him. "If we can find Holcomb," Bellamy said, setting down the third journal and looking at Caleb over his repaired spectacles, "this case changes entirely." "Martin Birch wrote that entry in 77, Caleb said, 6 years ago. Holcomb could be anywhere." "He could be," Bellamy said. "He could also be exactly where people who leave difficult employment tend to end up, someplace quieter, under a name that isn't entirely different from their own, doing work that doesn't require too many questions about the past." He picked up the journal again. Martin wrote that Holcomb left Vane's employ 3 years before the journal entry. So that's 9 years ago. A man can travel a long way in 9 years, but he can also not travel at all. "Where do you start looking?" "I start with Vane's known operations in 74-75, Bellamy said. "Properties he acquired, men he employed, lawsuits he filed. The Territorial Records Office has most of it. I know a man in Helena who can look at employment records from that period." He paused. "It'll take time." "How much time?" "I've asked the court to set the hearing date in February," Bellamy said. "That gives us 3 months. If Holcomb exists and can be found in 3 months, we'll find him. If not," he shrugged, "we go in with what we have." Caleb nodded. "There's something else," Bellamy said. He opened a folder on his desk, the organized kind that lived inside the apparent disorder, the kind that only made sense to the person who'd built it. He took out 2 pieces of paper. "I found the Billings Courier article from October of 78. Road closure, rockslide at the Blackthorn Pass, 3 weeks before the East Road was passable. Dated the 14th. He set it in front of Caleb. The article was brief, a paragraph really, the kind of routine notice that newspapers ran about road conditions. But it had a date, and it named the specific pass, and it was printed in ink on paper that had been sitting in an archive for 6 years. The claim delivery in Vane's document was dated the 22nd of October, Bellamy said. 8 days after the road closed, Caleb said. 8 days after the road closed, Bellamy confirmed. A delivery through a blocked pass is not possible. A document that claims one happened is therefore false. He picked up the article. This isn't the whole case, but it's the foundation. Caleb looked at the paper. At the small paragraph that described what had been, to whoever wrote it, a routine local inconvenience, and was now, 6 years later, a piece of evidence in a fight over a spring. Will it hold up? He asked. Against a lawyer of Vane's caliber? Bellamy said. He'll argue the delivery happened before the road closed. He'll argue the date on the document is a clerical error. He'll find someone to testify that they saw a wagon on that road in late October. He paused. That's why we need Holcomb. The weather record tells the judge the document is suspicious. Holcomb tells the judge why. Caleb rode back to the ranch that evening with the case laid out in his head, all its pieces, all its gaps, all the places where it could fall apart. He did this the way he thought through anything that mattered, starting from the worst outcome and working backward to find the places where a different decision might have changed it. He hadn't done that with his wife. He told himself there was nothing he could have done differently, and he believed it, mostly. But there were still nights when he ran the calendar backward and asked himself the unanswerable questions. That was grief's particular cruelty. It didn't allow for a final verdict. You carried the questions forever. He was not going to carry this one. 2 weeks later, the barn caught fire. It started in the early hours of a Sunday morning, hay in the back corner where the wall met the floor, going up fast because the October air was dry. Pete smelled it first and started shouting before Caleb was fully awake. By the time they were all out there with buckets, the back wall was well involved. They saved the barn. Not cleanly. The back quarter was gone. The roof in that section had to come down before it fell, and they lost 2 months of stored hay that would have to be replaced at prices that made Caleb do the math twice and not like the answer either time. But the structure stood. The horses were out and safe. Dutch had gotten them out first, before the water. Nobody was hurt. When the sun came up and the smoke was still coming off the burned section in thin threads, Caleb stood looking at the damage with his hands on his hips and Pete beside him doing the same. "They're done warning," Pete said. "Yes," Caleb said. "You need to tell Bellamy." "I will. And you need to think about whether Dutch and I need to be armed when we're away from the house," Pete said. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm planning to do. I wanted you to know." Caleb looked at him. "Be careful how you use it." "I'm always careful," Pete said, which was true. Pete was the most careful man Caleb had ever employed. He was also the most stubborn, and the combination was either very useful or very dangerous depending on the situation. Eliza had stood in the doorway through the whole firefight, Thomas on her hip, handing off refilled buckets in the chain they'd formed. She hadn't cried. She hadn't frozen. When it was over and they were standing in the pre-dawn dark smelling of smoke, she had assessed the structure with the practical eye of someone calculating what needed to happen next. Now she found Caleb at the edge of the burned section and stood beside him. Thomas settled on her back in the carrier she'd rigged from a length of cloth. Because at almost a year old he was heavy enough that carrying him on one hip all day had become unsustainable. "How much?" she asked. "Pays the worst of it," he said. "Replacement cost plus whatever the rebuild takes." He did the number in his head. "I can manage it." "We can manage it," she said. He looked at her. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't go back to acting like this is your problem and I'm a complication in it. I've been here since August. I'm not a complication." He took a breath. "No," he said. "You're not." "Then stop doing the math like I'm not in it," she said. "What do we need, and when do we need it?" He told her. She listened. She asked 2 questions that he hadn't thought of, both of which were good ones, and then she nodded and went back inside to start breakfast because it was 6 in the morning and there were 4 people who'd been fighting a fire all night and needed to eat. Caleb watched her go. He thought about what Margaret Dutton had said in Bozeman. He thought about the specific fact that he hadn't disagreed with her. The community meeting was Eliza's idea. She brought it up on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the fire, when the burned section had been cleared and the rebuilding had started and the cost had settled into the kind of ongoing pressure that you stop calculating because the number isn't going to change. "The people Vane has taken property from," she said. "The ones who ran, who settled, who left the territory. They're gone. But the ones who stayed, the ones who watched it happen to their neighbors and are still here, they're scared." She was at the kitchen table, and she'd pulled out the list she'd been building. It had grown, 10 names now. Scared people either go quiet or they get together. Vane is counting on the first. "What are you proposing?" Caleb asked. "I want to write to all of them," she said. "Not just the ones I already wrote to, all 10. I want to ask them to come here, to this ranch, for a meeting. I want Bellamy there. I want people to understand that there's a case being built and that their stories are part of it." "Vane will hear about it," Caleb said. "Vane already knows everything we do," Eliza said. "He knew about the case before I wrote the letters. He knew you'd gone to Billings. He had someone in Bozeman before I even wrote to Margaret." She looked at him steadily. "I'm tired of being careful about what he knows. He knows everything. What he doesn't know is whether we're going to fall apart or hold together. Let's show him which one." Pete, from the corner where he'd been mending a piece of harness, said without looking up, "She's right." Dutch, from his chair near the window, made a sound that in his economy of expression constituted strong agreement. Caleb looked at his people, his kitchen, his table, the woman across from him who had arrived in a cloud of August dust with $4.60 and a 10-month-old and had somehow become the reason that everything in this house was worth defending. "Write the letters," he said. She wrote them that night, all 10. She wrote for 2 hours at the small desk in the kitchen corner, and Caleb did not go to bed but sat at the table with a cup of coffee that went cold and then cold again, reading through the journals one more time, looking for anything they'd missed. They had missed something. He felt it the way you feel a loose board in a floor before you step on it. Not certain, not provable, just the particular unease of something not quite right. He found it in the 4th journal, near the beginning, a passage so brief he'd passed over it the first time. Vane mentioned in passing today that he has friends on the county bench. He said it like he was saying something about the weather. I don't think it was accidental. Caleb set the journal down. "Eliza," he said. She looked up from her letter. "What county is the hearing in?" he said. She went still. He could see her working it through. "Bellamy filed in the territorial court," she said slowly. "Not the county bench." "That's right," Caleb said. "And why did he do that?" She set down her pen. "Because he knew," she said. Bellamy already knew about the county bench. Caleb picked up the journal. Martin Birch wrote it in 77, 6 years ago. Bellamy's been fighting Vane for 8. He looked at her. "Bellamy knew before we did." She was quiet for a long moment. "Then he's thought of everything we haven't thought of," she said. "Most of it," Caleb said. "That's either very reassuring," she said, "or it means there are things even Bellamy hasn't found yet." She picked up her pen. Outside, the October night pressed cold against the windows, and somewhere on the east end of the property, the spring ran quiet and steady in the dark, the way it always had, indifferent to the human trouble gathering around it. She finished the letters. He sealed them. In the morning, Pete would take them to town. 10 letters to 10 people who had all, in their own ways, felt the weight of the same man's ambition, and who had not yet been asked to carry it together. The hearing was 11 weeks away. Caleb thought, 11 weeks is a long time for a man like Vane to work in. He thought, it's also a long time for the truth to travel. He went to check the barn one last time before bed. The new lumber pale against the old, the smell of fresh sawdust mixing with old smoke, and stood in the dark for a moment listening to the horses breathe, and then went inside. 7 of the 10 letters came back with answers. 3 said yes immediately. A rancher named Ed Collier from the Copper Creek area, a widow named Frances Marsh who'd lost her husband's grazing land 2 years prior, and a former merchant named Lyle Denton who'd moved to a smaller property after Vane's men had made his supply routes difficult enough to strangle his business without technically doing anything illegal. The other 4 took longer, arriving over the course of 2 weeks with the particular hesitation of people who wanted to say yes and were working up to it. 2 didn't answer at all. Caleb didn't count that as a loss. He'd expected worse. The meeting happened on a Saturday in late November, when the first real snow had come and gone and left the ground hard, and the air with that specific winter clarity that makes distances look shorter than they are. 7 people came to the Mercer Ranch and sat around a table that wasn't quite big enough, with extra chairs brought in from the bunkhouse and Eliza's kitchen producing enough food that nobody could claim they'd been brought here under false pretenses. Bellamy came from Billings, arriving the night before and sleeping in the spare room with his coat on because the heat didn't quite reach that corner of the house. He sat at the end of the table with his repaired spectacles and a leather folder, and the expression of a man who has seen enough human trouble to know that meetings like this one go one of 2 ways. Caleb opened it. He didn't make a speech. He explained the case, the journals, the weather records, the pattern. He said what Bellamy thought their chances were, which was honest rather than encouraging. He said what Vane had already done, Pete's bruised jaw, the fence, the barn, and said it plainly without performing outrage because these people didn't need to be told what outrage was appropriate. They'd brought their own. Then he stopped talking and let the room do what it was going to do. Ed Collier went first. He was a big man, weathered, with the kind of quiet that comes from having decided some years ago that words cost something and should be spent accordingly. He described a debt claim he'd received 4 years ago for money his father allegedly borrowed from an estate in Helena. His father had been dead 6 years. The estate turned out to be Harlow Aldis's. Eliza's head came up. "Aldis," she said. "Same name on my claim," Ed said, looking at her. "And mine," said Frances Marsh from the other side of the table. "My husband's claim." Aldis, lending money to a man Aldis had never met, documented in papers that looked right until you looked close. She paused. "We looked close too late." Bellamy was writing. Lyle Denton had a different story. No debt claim, just systematic interference. Supply wagons that were delayed or turned back. A fire at his warehouse that was ruled accidental. A competing merchant who arrived in town 8 months after the harassment started, selling at prices that made no economic sense unless someone was subsidizing the losses. "He didn't need to take my land," Denton said. "He just needed to make it not worth having. Then he bought it at half its value from a man who had no other choice." "Did you know the name of the competing merchant?" Bellamy asked. "Garrett," Denton said. "Thomas Garrett." Bellamy's pen stopped. Caleb noticed. He looked at Bellamy, who was looking at his notes with an expression that he was working to keep neutral. "You know that name," Caleb said. "Martin Birch's journal," Bellamy said. "The entry about Holcomb. Vane keeps a man named Garrett who specializes in constructing false debt claims." He looked at Denton. "Did this Garrett have any connection to document handling? Any legal filings on the merchant operation?" Denton thought. "He filed a business registration," he said. "I remember because I tried to look into his background and the registration was the only thing I could find. It listed a Helena address." "Can you remember the street?" "Calder Avenue," Denton said. "Something on Calder Avenue." Bellamy wrote it down with the specific care of a man who has found the thread he's been pulling for. The meeting ran 3 hours. By the end of it, Bellamy had 7 accounts, 6 of which mentioned either the Aldous name, the Garrett name, or both. He had dates. He had property descriptions. He had, from Frances Marsh, a letter her husband had received from a man who claimed to represent the Aldous estate, signed with a name that appeared nowhere in any actual estate record Bellamy had been able to find. When people started to leave, there was a different quality to the room than when they'd arrived. Not confidence, exactly. Not the clean resolution of people who found their answer. More like the specific relief of people who have been carrying something alone and have discovered, almost by accident, that the weight is distributed differently when there are more hands under it. Ed Collier was the last to go. He stopped at the door and turned to Caleb. "Vane's going to hear about this meeting," he said. "I know," Caleb said. "He'll come at you harder." "I know that too." Ed looked at him for a moment. "I should have fought mine," he said. "I had the money to fight, and I didn't because I thought it'd cost more than it was worth." He paused. "I was wrong about that. Losing costs more than fighting. It just costs slower, so you don't notice till it's already gone." He put on his hat and walked out into the November cold. Caleb closed the door. Eliza was behind him in the hallway with Thomas, who had spent the afternoon being passed between the arms of 7 different strangers and had submitted to this with the ease of a child who has been among people enough to find them interesting rather than alarming. "Garrett," she said. "Bellamy thinks he can find him." "He thinks he can find where Garrett operates from," Caleb said. "That's not the same thing." "No?" she said. "But it's closer." Bellamy found Holcomb 3 weeks before the hearing. He sent a letter to Caleb on a Tuesday. Not his usual careful legal prose, but something shorter, more urgent, written in a hand that suggested he'd drafted it standing up. "Found our man. He goes by Hollis now, working as a clerk at a freight company in Livingston. He remembers everything. He is frightened but willing to talk, provided certain conditions are met. Ride to Billings at your earliest convenience." Caleb rode to Billings the next morning. Holcomb? Hollis now, a thin man in his late 40s with the eyes of someone who has been looking over his shoulder long enough that it has become a permanent physical habit, was sitting in Bellamy's office when Caleb arrived. He shook Caleb's hand with a grip that was trying to project more confidence than it felt. "Mr. Bellamy says you're the one who found the Birch journals," Hollis said. "A woman named Clara Birch found them first," Caleb said. "I just carried them." Hollis nodded. He looked at his hands. "What Martin Birch wrote about what I told him is accurate," he said. "I worked for Silas Vane from 1870 to 1874. I handled correspondence and filing. I saw the Garrett operation from the beginning." "What exactly is the Garrett operation?" Caleb asked. Hollis was quiet for a moment, gathering either courage or the right sequence of words. "Thomas Garrett is not a merchant," he said. "He's never been a merchant. He finds dead estates, people who died without heirs, without wills, without anyone left to dispute a claim made in their name. He constructs loan documents, delivery records, witness accounts. He has 2 or 3 men he uses for witness testimony. He files through county courts because county courts don't have the resources to investigate thoroughly." He paused. "The Aldous estate was one of 4 he was using when I left Vane's employ. There may be more now." "You witnessed this directly?" Bellamy asked. "I filed some of the correspondence," Hollis said. I didn't understand what I was doing for the first 2 years. I understood what I was doing for the last 2. By then I had enough sense to keep copies of certain things before I left. Caleb and Bellamy both went still. What kind of copies? Bellamy asked, very carefully. Hollis reached into his coat and removed an envelope. Inside were 4 pages, hand-copied, in a careful clerk's hand. These are correspondence records, he said. Between Vane's office and Garrett, they include instructions for the Aldous debt claims, specific language to use, properties to target, timing. He laid them on Bellamy's desk. I've had these for 9 years. I've moved 4 times. I sleep with them in a case under my bed. Bellamy picked up the pages. He read through them slowly. His expression did not change, but his breathing did, in the way of a man who has learned not to show what he's feeling in front of others, but whose body hasn't entirely learned the same lesson. These are instructions, Bellamy said, direct instructions from Vane's office to Garrett for the construction of false debt instruments. Yes, Hollis said. Will you testify to their authenticity in court? Bellamy asked. Hollis's jaw tightened. That's the condition, he said. If I testify, I need to know that Vane can't come after me afterward. I need to know that what I say in court is on a record that can't be buried or delayed or transferred to a county bench where his friends sit. We're in territorial court, Bellamy said. Judge Aldrich. He's not Vane's friend. He's not anyone's friend, which is the best thing I can say about him. He leaned forward. Mr. Hollis, what you've been holding for 9 years, is the center of this case. I can build a structure around it. I can present the Birch journals, the weather records, the testimony from 7 people who were targeted the same way. But this, he touched the copied pages, this is the thing that makes it a pattern instead of a dispute. Hollis looked at Caleb. What happens to you if we lose? He asked. It was a strange question. Caleb considered it honestly. I lose the spring, he said. Eliza loses her freedom from the debt claim. Vane gets what he came for, and we spend the next several years in a worse position than we're in now. And if we win, I keep my land, Caleb said. Eliza keeps her name, and whatever Bellamy can do with what you've given him, he does. Hollis was quiet for a long moment. Outside Bellamy's window, Billings went about its December business, indifferent and continuous. I'll testify, Hollis said. Attempt. The hearing was set for the 14th of February in the Territorial Courthouse in Billings, which was a building that took itself seriously. High ceilings, dark wood, the particular smell of law and old paper, and the anxiety of people waiting for decisions to be made about their lives. Caleb and Eliza arrived the day before with Pete driving the wagon. Dutch had stayed at the ranch because someone had to, and because Dutch had said without elaborating that he'd be more useful there than in a courtroom, which Caleb understood to mean that Dutch did not trust himself to sit quietly if things went badly. Thomas stayed at the boarding house with Pete and a young woman named Annie, the proprietress's daughter, who had taken one look at Thomas and declared herself his temporary caretaker with the authority of someone who knows babies and is not asking permission. Thomas appeared to consider this arrangement acceptable. Bellamy met them at the courthouse steps the morning of the hearing. He looked, for the first time since Caleb had known him, like a man who hadn't slept well. Something's wrong, Caleb said. Not wrong, Bellamy said. Complicated. Vane's lawyer is Franklin Hess. Caleb didn't know the name. Eliza did. Her face told him. Hess won 3 territorial cases last year, she said quietly. One of them was a water rights dispute. He destroyed the opposing lawyer in 2 hours, and the man left practice afterward. He's very good, Bellamy said, in the tone of a man who respects a thing and intends to defeat it anyway. He'll go after the journals first, chain of custody, hearsay, the reliability of a dead man's private notes. He'll argue that Birch was predisposed against Vane and wrote accordingly. And Hollis? Caleb asked. Hollis is our strongest piece, and Hess knows it, which means he'll know about the copies and he'll attack the authenticity. He'll claim they're forgeries. He'll bring in a document examiner. Bellamy paused. I have my own document examiner. He'll say the opposite. Then it comes down to whose examiner the judge believes, Eliza said. It comes down to the full weight of everything together, Bellamy said. The weather record, the journals, the 7 accounts, Hollis's testimony, the copies, any one of them alone, Hess dismantles. All of them together. That's harder to take apart without the whole thing looking like exactly what it is. He looked at both of them. I want you to be prepared for this to be difficult today. Hess is going to make Eliza look like a woman with a history of debt and poor judgment. He's going to make the Birch journals look like the grievances of a failed man looking for someone to blame. He's going to make Hollis look like a disgruntled former employee with an agenda. All three of those things will feel personal, Caleb said. Yes, Bellamy said. Don't react. Whatever he says, don't react. Eliza looked at Bellamy steadily. I have been sitting across from men who underestimate me my entire adult life, she said. I know how to not react. Bellamy looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. I believe you do. They went inside. Franklin Hess was everything Bellamy had described, and also, in some way Caleb hadn't anticipated, something more. A man who understood the theater of a courtroom the way a conductor understands an orchestra, who knew how to make a gallery lean forward and a judge's pen hesitate. He was younger than Bellamy by 15 years, polished without being slick, with the specific gravity of someone who wins often enough that losing has stopped feeling like a real possibility. He was very good. He established in the first hour that Harlow Aldous had indeed been a merchant of some standing in Helena, that records existed of his business operations, that it was not implausible that such a man would make private loans. He presented 2 witnesses who testified under oath that they had personally seen a delivery wagon on the East Road in October of '78, not through the Blackthorn Pass specifically, they admitted under Bellamy's cross-examination, but in the general region. Bellamy let that sit. He introduced the Courier article. Hess objected to its relevance. Judge Aldrich, a narrow man in his 60s with the expression of someone who has heard every argument twice and is unimpressed by all of them, overruled the objection and allowed it, but with a look at Bellamy that suggested it had better matter. It mattered. The road closure was dated and specific. The claim delivery in Vane's document was dated 8 days after the closure and described a route that required the Blackthorn Pass. Hess argued that the delivery might have taken an alternate route. Bellamy produced a territorial survey showing that no alternate route existed that could accommodate a loaded wagon in October conditions, back and forth, each point contested, each counter countered. The Birch journals came in at noon. Hess went after them exactly as Bellamy had predicted. Hearsay, bias, the unreliability of a man who believed himself wronged, and wrote accordingly. He was effective enough that Caleb, watching from his seat, felt the ground shift slightly under the case. Then Bellamy called Ed Collier, and Francis Marsh, and Lyle Denton, and 4 others, one by one, each of them describing the Aldous name, the same construction of false debt, the same pattern of intimidation that followed the claim. Hess cross-examined each of them, and he was skilled at it, finding inconsistencies, challenging memories, making the whole thing look like a collection of aggrieved people who had found each other and decided to pool their grievances against a successful man. He almost succeeded. Caleb could see it. He could see Judge Aldrich's pen moving in notes that could have meant anything. Then Bellamy called Hollis. Hess objected before Hollis had said 20 words. Former employee, personal grievance, no standing to speak to Vane's business practices. Judge Aldrich sustained the first objection on procedural grounds, and for a moment the whole architecture Bellamy had built seemed to sway. Bellamy asked for a recess. In the hallway outside, Caleb said, "Tell me." "The copies," Bellamy said. "If I can get the copies in front of the judge as a document rather than as Hollis's testimony, Hess can't block them the same way." He was thinking fast, visibly, in the way of a man used to doing his best thinking when circumstances have narrowed the available space. Hollis doesn't need to testify to what Vane did. He needs to testify to what he personally handled and filed. That's not hearsay. That's direct experience. "Is that different enough?" Eliza asked. "It has to be," Bellamy said. They went back in. Bellamy reframed his questions. Hollis testified not to what he'd observed Vane ordering, but to what he himself had filed. Specific correspondence, specific dates, specific instructions he'd been given for language to use in documents going to a man named Garrett at an address on Calder Avenue in Helena. He testified to the copies as records he'd made of documents that had passed through his own hands. Hess objected. Overruled. Hess objected again, on authenticity grounds. Bellamy produced his document examiner. Hess produced his. They disagreed, as predicted. Judge Aldrich looked at both of them with the expression of a man who finds expert witnesses tiresome and asked Bellamy what other evidence he had for the copy's authenticity. Bellamy said, "The address, Your Honor. Calder Avenue in Helena." Mr. Denton testified to a business registration at that address for an operation connected to Thomas Garrett. If the court will allow me to introduce the Helena Business Registry records from 1874, the address appears under Garrett's name with a registration date that predates the earliest claimed Aldous debt by 7 months. A pause. Judge Aldrich said, "You have those records?" "I do," Bellamy said. He produced them. He had spent considerable money obtaining them and had not told Caleb the full amount, which Caleb suspected was deliberate. Hess asked for a recess. In the brief quiet while the judge conferred with his clerk, Caleb looked at Eliza. She was sitting straight in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, which was the posture she used when she was containing something significant, and she was looking at the table in front of her with an expression that was entirely still. He put his hand over hers briefly. She didn't move, but the quality of her stillness changed. They went back on the record. Hess fought the registry records with everything he had. He argued irrelevance, coincidence, insufficient connection to the debt claim. He was skilled and he was fast and he didn't show anything on his face, which was how Caleb knew he was scared. Franklin Hess argued for 40 minutes and nothing he said was stupid, and none of it was quite enough. Judge Aldrich was quiet for a long time after Hess finished. He looked at his notes. He looked at the pile of documents before him, the weather records, the journals, the 7 accounts, the Hollis copies, the business registry. He looked at Silas Vane, who was seated at the back of the gallery in the good coat, with the careful face giving nothing away. "This court finds," Judge Aldrich said, "that the debt instrument presented by the plaintiff lacks sufficient authenticity to support judgment. The weather records and survey documentation establish that the claimed delivery could not have occurred as described. The pattern of identical instruments across multiple properties, the connection of the Garrett name to the correspondence records introduced by the defense, and the business registry evidence constitute, in aggregate, a credible case for the systematic manufacture of false debt claims." A sound moved through the gallery. Not loud, more like a collective exhale. "The debt claim against Mrs. Eliza Hartwell is dismissed," the judge said. "The water rights and property of Caleb Mercer remain with their owner of record. The court will refer the matter of the fraudulent instruments to the Territorial Attorney General for further review." Hess was on his feet immediately with motions. The judge acknowledged them and set a date for further argument and said with a tone that did not invite debate that he was not inclined to revisit the central findings. Caleb sat in his chair in the dark wood courtroom and did not perform anything for anyone's benefit. He was not the performing kind. He sat with the verdict settling into him the way cold water settles, slowly, thoroughly, reaching places you didn't know were dry. Beside him, Eliza let out a breath. Just one. Small enough that nobody in the gallery would have noticed. He noticed. "All right," she said very quietly, to him specifically, to no one else. "All right," he said back. Bellamy was on his feet managing the procedural aftermath with the focused competence of a man doing what he's best at. Hollis was near the door, talking to no one, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has done the thing they've been dreading and found the other side of it survivable. Ed Collier, in the second row, had his hat in his hands and was turning it by the brim, around and around. Across the gallery, Silas Vane stood. He buttoned his coat. He looked at the front of the room for a moment with an expression that Caleb was too far away to read precisely, but that he understood in general, the look of a man recalculating. Not broken. Men like Vane didn't break in a single afternoon. But recalculating. Reassessing what was possible and what had become, today, more costly than it was worth. He walked out without looking at Caleb or Eliza. Caleb watched him go. He thought, this isn't over for him. Men like that find another way. He thought, but today, on this day, in this courtroom, he lost. That's real. Whatever comes after, this happened. Bellamy appeared at his elbow, slightly out of breath from the procedural management. The referral to the Attorney General is meaningful, Bellamy said. It doesn't guarantee prosecution, but it means the territory is now officially aware. It makes the next Aldous claim significantly more difficult. How significantly? Caleb asked. Enough, Bellamy said. For now, enough. Enough. It was not the complete victory that stories promised and real life rarely delivered. The barn was still half rebuilt. The hay still needed replacing. The legal fees were an amount Caleb was going to be working around for the better part of a year. Hollis was going to spend some time looking over his shoulder regardless of how the Attorney General's review went. But the spring was his. The debt was dismissed. Eliza's name was clean in the court record. Outside the courthouse, in the February cold that was just beginning to relent toward the idea of spring somewhere in its distant future, Pete was waiting at the bottom of the steps with the wagon and the expression of a man who has been told the result and is too old and too private to show what he thinks about it. Thomas was in the wagon in Annie's arms, looking around at the street with enormous interest, apparently finding Billings in February entirely satisfactory. When he saw Eliza on the steps, he made a sound, not a word yet, but on its way to being one, and reached for her. She went down the steps fast and picked him up and held him against her with her face in his hair. And she stood like that for a moment, in the February cold outside the courthouse, while Pete pretended to check something on the wagon and Bellamy found somewhere else to look. Caleb came down the steps and stood beside her. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying that the moment wasn't already saying for itself. After a while, Thomas reached out a hand and grabbed Caleb's coat. His grip was strong for 11 months. He held on with the absolute confidence of someone who has decided that this person is his to hold on to and has no intention of letting go. Caleb looked down at him. Thomas looked back with those enormous dark eyes, calm and certain and entirely sure of where he was. The February wind came down the street and moved on. They rode home the next morning. Not that same evening. Bellamy had paperwork that needed signatures, and Thomas had fallen asleep in Annie's arms at the boarding house with the absolute conviction of a child who has decided the day is over, regardless of what the adults think, and nobody had the heart to move him until morning. So they stayed one more night in Billings, and Caleb sat up late in the small parlor of the boarding house while Pete slept and Eliza nursed Thomas down a second time, and the town outside settled into its nighttime sounds. He thought about what had happened in that courtroom, not the legal mechanics of it, which he'd leave to Bellamy to manage. The other thing, the moment when Thomas had grabbed his coat on the courthouse steps and held on, and the feeling that had moved through him, not dramatic, not the kind of thing you'd put into a speech, just the quiet recognition that something had shifted in him permanently, and there was no point pretending otherwise. He wasn't the same man who'd put that advertisement on the post in Billings 8 months ago. He wasn't even the man who'd watched a woman walk up his road in August dust with a baby on her hip and told himself he was letting her stay out of practical necessity. He'd stopped lying to himself about that sometime around October. He just hadn't done anything about it yet, because doing something about it required saying words out loud, and he'd spent 3 years in a house where the only words that mattered were the ones he never got to say to the person who should have heard them. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in months. The wagon ride home took most of 2 days. The February cold was real but not brutal, the kind of cold that made the air sharp and the light very clear and the distances honest. Thomas rode between Eliza and Pete on the wagon seat for most of the first day, conducting what appeared to be a serious ongoing conversation with Pete in a language that was approximately 40% recognizable words and 60% something only Thomas fully understood. Pete responded to all of it with complete gravity, which Thomas found deeply satisfactory. Caleb rode alongside on the bay gelding and watched the land come back to him mile by mile. The familiar landmarks, the particular way the ridge looked from the south approach, the stand of cottonwoods that meant they were getting close. When the ranch buildings came into view in the late afternoon of the second day, he felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was held. Dutch was at the gate. He'd seen them coming from a long way off, the way you learn to see things when you've been watching for them. "How'd it go?" he asked. "We won," Caleb said. Dutch nodded slowly. He looked at the wagon, at Eliza and Thomas and Pete. He looked back at Caleb. "Good," he said, and swung the gate open. That was Dutch's version of celebration, and it was enough. The barn rebuilding finished in March, when the ground was still cold, but the days had started to lengthen in that tentative way that makes you believe in things before you have solid evidence for them. Caleb and Dutch did most of it themselves, with Ed Collier riding over 2 weekends to help with the heavy framing because he'd said he would, and he was the kind of man who meant what he said. The new section was slightly larger than what had burned because Caleb had thought about it over winter and decided that if he was rebuilding anyway, he might as well build right. The hay replacement had cost more than he wanted. The legal fees were something he was managing in installments that Bellamy had arranged without comment, which was one of the things Caleb had come to appreciate about Bellamy. He understood that winning in court didn't mean winning in life, and he didn't treat his clients like their financial struggles were an inconvenience to the case. News from Bellamy came in a letter in late March. The Territorial Attorney General had opened a formal inquiry into the Aldous debt instruments. Thomas Garrett had been located in Helena and served with papers. Garrett's response had been to immediately offer to cooperate with the inquiry in exchange for consideration, which Bellamy described as exactly what a man does when he realizes the structure above him is falling and he'd prefer not to be standing underneath it. Silas Vane had retained 3 lawyers. "He's fighting the Attorney General's inquiry?" Eliza asked, reading over Caleb's shoulder. "He has the resources to fight it for years if he wants to," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. Thomas was on the floor near her feet, working on a wooden puzzle that Dutch had made him over winter. Fitted pieces of different shapes that went together in one specific way, which Thomas treated as a personal challenge and attacked with total focus. "Will it matter?" she asked. "Even if Vane fights it for years? Will it matter that it happened?" Caleb thought about that honestly. "Garrett's already cooperating," he said. "Whatever he tells the Attorney General is going to be on a record. The connection to Vane is on a record. The pattern across multiple properties is on a record." He folded the letter. "Men like Vane don't fall all at once. They fall piece by piece over time, and each piece makes the next one easier to remove." He paused. "Martin Birch's journal is on a record now. Clara Birch's letter, Hollis's testimony, Francis Marsh and Ed Collier and all the others." He looked at her. "That's not nothing." She looked at Thomas on the floor, who had gotten 3 pieces fitted and was eyeing the 4th, with the expression of someone who has identified a problem and is working on the solution. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." The conversation Caleb had been putting off happened on an evening in April, when the snow was mostly gone, and the cottonwoods along the ridge were doing the thing they do in early spring, that almost green that isn't quite a color yet, more like the memory of one. He found her at the spot where he used to stand with his wife. She'd gone out there on her own, which she'd never done before, and he'd watched from the house for a few minutes before he went out because he wasn't sure if she wanted company, and he'd learned, over 8 months, that Eliza Hartwell's solitude was a thing that sometimes needed to be respected. But she heard him coming and didn't move away, which was its own kind of answer. He stood beside her. The valley below was doing what valleys do in April, coming back, slowly, in patches, the green arriving in the low places first and working upward. "I come out here sometimes," she said. "I hope that's all right." "It's all right," he said. They stood for a while without talking, which they'd gotten good at, the kind of quiet that doesn't require filling. "I've been thinking about leaving," she said. He went still. "Not because I want to," she said, before he could say anything. "Because I've been trying to figure out what the right thing is, and I keep running into the fact that I don't know anymore what I want and what I think I should want." She turned and looked at him. "I came here with nothing. I've been here 8 months. You fought a legal case that cost you money you didn't have because of me, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped being your cook and started being something I don't have a clean word for. And I don't know if it happened because of the circumstances or because of something real." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Do you remember what you said to me," he said, "that first evening at the Cottonwoods? About what this looked like from the inside?" She thought. "2 people who've both lost things trying to figure out what's left," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've thought about that a lot." He turned so he was facing her directly, which was not something he did often when there was something important at stake. He was more inclined to look at the middle distance when the stakes were real, as if direct eye contact might jinx it. But he was done with that particular habit. What happened between us didn't happen because of the circumstances. It happened while the circumstances were happening. That's different. She looked at him. I'm not who I was when I put that advertisement up, he said. And I know it. I know what changed, and I know when it started changing, and I know you're the reason. He stopped, tried again, because that wasn't quite right, and he wanted to be right about this. I know you're not the reason something broke. You're the reason something held together when it had every reason to come apart, and I'm not confused about the difference. The April wind moved through the cottonwoods and carried the sound down the valley. I have a son who isn't yours, she said. Thomas is... He stopped. He thought about the rattle he'd made, the nights in the kitchen with the fever, the courthouse steps, and the small grip on his coat. Thomas is someone I would choose, he said, if choosing were the thing, which I think it is. She held his gaze for a long time. She was doing the thing she always did, working it through, examining it from multiple angles, looking for the place where it might be less solid than it appeared. He'd come to recognize it as one of the most honest things about her. She didn't accept anything, including good things, without making sure they were real first. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I've noticed, he said. I have opinions about everything. I've noticed that too. And I will fight you on the things I think matter, and I won't apologize for it. I know, he said. I'd rather have that than the other kind. Something moved through her face. Not quite a smile, but the space where one was building. The other kind? She said. The kind that agrees with everything and means nothing, he said. I had quiet for 3 years. Quiet isn't the same as peace. I know the difference now. She looked at the valley for a moment. The light was doing the complicated thing it does in April evenings, the colors shifting through something warm before they settled into the blue of dusk. Ask me properly, she said. He did. He was not eloquent about it. He didn't have a speech prepared, and he was not the kind of man who could have delivered one if he had. He said what he meant in the plainest way he could manage, which was that he wanted her to stay. Not as a cook, not as a woman who'd been through something difficult and landed somewhere safe, but as his wife, as the person this ranch belonged to the same as it belonged to him, as the person he intended to spend the rest of his life being the best version of himself around. She said yes. She said it the same way she did most things, without performance, without cushioning, directly, and with her eyes open. Then she said, I'm still going to argue with you about the kitchen garden. I know, he said, and the barn roof. I think you built the east pitch wrong and water's going to pool there in heavy rain. Dutch agrees with you, he said. I'm fixing it in May. She almost laughed. Fully this time, not covered, not contained, and the sound of it went out over the valley and the cottonwoods and the spring on the east end of the property that had started all of this and was still running, cold and clear and indifferent to the human trouble it had caused, the way springs do. They married in June under the old cottonwood at the top of the ridge, the one that could see the whole valley, that his father had planted the same year he'd built the house, that had been standing there watching the property go through all its seasons of good and terrible. Bellamy came, because he had earned it. Ed Collier came. Frances Marsh came with her daughter. Pete wore a clean shirt, which was the most formal thing anyone had ever seen him do, and Dutch stood at the edge of the gathering in the way Dutch stood everywhere, a little outside, entirely present. Margaret Dutton came from Bozeman, because Eliza had asked her, and because she was the kind of woman who understood that saying yes to things is how you end up in the moments that matter. Thomas, at 13 months, had recently decided that walking was preferable to crawling and was conducting himself with the focused intensity of someone managing a new skill in front of an audience. He walked from Pete to Dutch, Dutch to Eliza to Caleb, and back again in a circuit that had no apparent purpose beyond the walking itself, and everyone watched him with the particular attention that small humans command when they're doing the work of becoming. There was no formal ceremony. Caleb had asked the county clerk to come out, which the county clerk had done with the expression of a man who doesn't usually make house calls, but has decided this is a reasonable exception. The legal part took 10 minutes. The rest of it, the food, the people, the afternoon light doing its best work over the valley, lasted until evening. At some point, Pete sat down on a log with a plate of food and said to no one in particular, "This is better than salt pork and beans." And several people laughed, and Caleb heard it from across the gathering and thought, yes, it is. Os. The Attorney General's inquiry produced results in September. Thomas Garrett entered a full cooperation agreement and testified to the systematic manufacture of debt instruments across 11 properties over 7 years. 3 of the men who'd served as false witnesses were charged. The Aldis estate, which had been used as a vehicle for 6 separate fraudulent claims, was officially closed by order of the territorial court. Silas Vane was not charged. His lawyers were very good, and the distance he'd maintained between himself and Garrett's operations was carefully constructed and difficult to bridge in court. But 2 of his county court connections were investigated. 1 resigned. The land Vane had acquired through the fraudulent claims was subject to challenge, and 3 families filed to have their properties reviewed. Bellamy wrote to Caleb about all of this over the course of several letters, each one more detailed than the last, in the way of a man who understands that the work isn't finished, but is satisfied with the progress. In the final letter he wrote, "Vane will not be the man he was. The inquiry has cost him money, reputation, and 2 of the county relationships that made his operation possible. He is not finished, but he is diminished. In my experience, that is often the best outcome available, and it is not nothing." Caleb read that letter twice and then gave it to Eliza, who read it once, nodded, and went back to what she'd been doing, which was writing a letter of her own to Clara Birch's sister, Margaret. He watched her for a moment, at the small desk in the kitchen corner, the one she'd set up quietly in her 2nd month, and that had become as natural a part of the room as the stove or the window. Thomas was on the floor nearby, asleep in the portable chair that had been replaced twice now because he kept growing out of them. The kitchen smelled like the soup on the stove and the bread from this morning, and the particular lived-in smell of a house where people actually live. He thought about what justice looked like when you were standing inside it rather than at a distance. It didn't look the way it did in stories, clean and complete, every wrong righted, every person exactly where they deserved to be. It looked like this, incomplete, imperfect, with loose ends still trailing. Vane still had his properties and his lawyers and his carefully constructed distance from the things he'd ordered done. Some of the people he'd hurt would never get their land back. Martin Birch was still dead, and Clara Birch was still alone. But Hollis had his life back, or the beginning of one. Ed Collier had his account on a court record. Frances Marsh's husband's name was no longer attached to a debt he'd never owed. And the Aldis instrument, the specific tool that had been used to take things from people who couldn't afford to lose them, was officially, permanently closed. The truth had traveled. That mattered. Even when it didn't reach everywhere it should have, even when the man responsible was sitting in his office in Helena, surrounded by expensive lawyers, the truth had traveled and left marks that couldn't be unmade. That was what Eliza had understood from the beginning when she'd built her list of names and written her 10 letters. Not that they would destroy Vane, she'd never promised that, and she was too honest to pretend she'd believed it. But that the truth, properly documented and properly witnessed, was the only thing that outlasted the people who told it. It was the only inheritance that couldn't be stolen by debt instruments or burned in a barn fire or intimidated away by men on a road. You put it on record. You made sure other people knew, and then you lived your life because that was also something worth doing. Wet. Thomas said his first clear word in October. Not mama, which he'd been approximating for weeks in ways that Eliza counted, and Caleb pretended not to track. Not the names for food or the names for animals, which he'd also been working on. He said Pete. He walked up to Pete at the breakfast table, put both hands on Pete's knee, looked directly at him, and said it. Not approximated, not a near thing, but clear and specific. Pete stopped eating. He looked down at Thomas for a long moment. His face did the thing it rarely did, the thing that required the kind of stillness that comes from a feeling that's too large to let move. Pete said finally. Thomas said it again. Pete picked up his fork. Don't read too much into it, he said, to no one in particular. He probably just likes the sound. Dutch made a sound that in Dutch's economy of expression was a laugh. Eliza covered her mouth. Caleb looked at his plate and let Pete have his dignity. But later that day he found Pete at the fence line, doing the routine maintenance he did every October. And Thomas was with him in the wooden carrier on Caleb's back, and Pete was talking to Thomas the same way he always did. Straight, no baby voice, as if Thomas were a small person with opinions worth engaging. And Thomas was listening with the serious attention he brought to Pete specifically. Caleb stood for a moment and watched. He thought, this is what happens when you stop running from the things that hurt and start building something with the years you have left. Not a replacement for what was lost. A replacement was always a lie, always slightly wrong in the specific ways that loss is always specific. But something new, something with its own weight and its own reasons for being. He'd learned it the slow way, the only way some things get learned. He'd needed a woman to walk up his road in August dust and refuse to apologize for needing things, and a baby to grab his coat on courthouse steps and hold on, and a spring he'd inherited from his father to be worth fighting for, and the particular stubbornness of a lawyer with wire-repaired spectacles, and 7 accounts of people who'd been through the same thing. He'd needed all of it. The loss first. Because without it, he wouldn't have understood what he was building toward. And then the building, slow, imperfect, sometimes expensive, occasionally on fire. That was the thing nobody told you about grief. Not that it ended. It didn't, not entirely. It just became something you carried differently, something that stopped taking up all the available space. What they didn't tell you was that the space it left behind could hold other things, not to fill the gap. There was no filling the gap, but to exist alongside it, real and present and worth having. His wife had loved this ridge. She would have liked Eliza, he thought. The specific way she would have liked her. With the recognition of someone meeting a person who doesn't need to be managed or reassured, who just needs room to be what she already is. She would have found Thomas hilarious. She would have gotten Pete to talk more than anyone had ever managed, because she'd had that particular gift for making silent people feel like what they carried was worth saying. He let himself think about her fully, which he hadn't allowed in a long time. Not the grief version, the contracted, painful version, but the actual person, the one who had laughed at things he said and argued about weather predictions and made coffee that was always slightly too strong and didn't apologize for it. He could do that now. He could think about her, and it hurt in the way of something real, but it didn't pull him under. He'd found the surface. He'd found, improbably, people to swim with. Thomas grabbed his ear from behind and said something emphatic. "I hear you," Caleb said. He turned and walked back toward the house, toward the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, toward Eliza visible through the window at her desk, toward Pete ambling along behind him with the unhurried pace of a man who has been on ranches all his life and understands that the work is always there, and you get to it when you get to it. The spring ran on the east end of the property, cold and clear in the October cold, doing what it had always done. The cottonwoods were turning, the yellow that comes before letting go, the particular extravagance of things that know their season is ending and decide to be beautiful about it. The ranch was not a perfect place. The east pitch on the barn roof had needed fixing, and Caleb had fixed it in May, which Eliza noted without saying she'd told him so, which was its own kind of grace. The kitchen garden had been extended again and would need serious work in the spring, because Eliza had plans that went beyond what the current layout could support. Pete had an ache in his right knee that he didn't mention and that everyone noticed. Dutch had started teaching Thomas to identify bird calls, which Thomas received as the most important project currently underway anywhere in the world. None of it was the life Caleb had planned. None of it was the life Eliza had planned either. Plans were like that. Useful up to the point where they ran into actual living, and then you put them down and worked with what you had. What he had was this: a spring that was his, a rebuilt barn, a woman who argued with him about roof pitches and kitchen gardens and meant every word and was right more often than not. A boy who said Pete first and grabbed coat collars and was becoming day by day someone specific, not just a baby, a person, with preferences and humor and the particular stubbornness that Caleb had noted from the beginning and that Eliza said came from Robert, and that Caleb suspected was also entirely its own. A place where people came to work and found themselves staying. A house that smelled like food and effort and the specific warmth of people who have decided, each in their own way, that this is worth showing up for. He went inside. The door closed behind him. The October wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the ridge held the last of the light a little longer than the valley below, the way high places always do, reluctant to let the day go. Then that light faded too, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, the real quiet, not the empty kind, but the quiet of people who have come through something difficult and arrived, still standing, on the other side of it. That kind of quiet is earned. It doesn't come from the absence of trouble. It comes from having faced it, with whatever you had available, alongside whoever showed up to face it with you. That's all it ever is in the end. That, and the willingness to let the door open when someone knocks.